The luxury trap. The rise of farming was a very gradual affair, spread over centuries and millennia. A band of Homo sapiens gathering mushrooms and nuts and hunting deer and rabbit did not all of a sudden settle in a permanent village, plowing fields, sowing wheat, and carrying water from the river. The change proceeded by stages, each of which involved just a small alteration in daily life. Homo sapiens reached the Middle East around 70,000 years ago. For the next 50 years, our ancestors flourished there with their agriculture. The natural resources of the area was enough to support its human population. In times of plenty, people had a few more children, and in times of need, a few less. Humans, like many mammals, have hormonal and genetic mechanisms that help control procreation. In good times, females reach puberty earlier and their chances of getting pregnant are a bit higher. In bad times, puberty is late and fertility decrease. To these natural population controls were other cultural mechanisms. Babies and small children, who more slowly and demand much more attention, were a burden on nomadic foragers. People tried to space their children 3 to 4 years apart. Women did so by nursing their children around the clock, and until a late age, around the clock cycling significantly decreased the chances of getting pregnant. Other methods include full or partial sexual abstinence, backed perhaps by cultural taboos, abortions, and occasionally infanticide. During these long millennia, people occasionally ate wheat grain, but this was a marginal part of their diet. About 18,000 years ago, the last ice age gave way to a period of global warming. As temperatures rose, so did rainfall. The new climate was ideal for Middle Eastern wheat and other cereals, which multiplied and spread. People began eating more wheat, and in exchange, they inevitably spread its growth. Since it was impossible to eat wild grains without first winnowing, grinding, and cooking them, people who gathered these grains carried them back to their temporary campsites for processing. Wheat grains are small and numerous, so some of them inevitably fell on the way to the campsite and were lost. Over time, more and more wheat grew along favorite human trails and near campsites. When humans burned down forests and thickets, this also helped wheat. Fire cleared away trees and shrubs, allowing wheat and other grasses to monopolize the sunlight, water, and nutrients. Where wheat became particularly abundant, and game and the other food sources were also plentiful, human bands could gradually give up their nomadic lifestyle and settle down in seasonal and even permanent camps. At first, they might have camped for 4 weeks during the harvest. A generation later, as wheat plants multiplied and spread, the harvest camp might have lasted for 5 weeks, then 6, then finally it became a permanent village. Evidence of such settlements has been discovered throughout the Middle East, particularly in the Levant, where the Natufian culture flourished about 12,500 years BC to 9,500 BC. The Natufians were hunter-gatherers who subsisted on dozens of wild species, but they lived in permanent villages and devoted much of their time to the intensive gathering and processing wild cereals. They built some stone houses and granaries. They stored grain for times of need. They invented new tools such as stone scythe for harvesting wild wheat, stone pestles, and mortars to grind it. In the years following 5000 9500 BC, the descendants of Natufians continued to gather and process cereals, but they also began to cultivate them in more and more elaborate ways. When gathering wild grains, they took care to lay aside part of the harvest to show the fields the next season. They discovered that they could achieve much better results by sowing the grains deep in the ground rather than haphazardly scattering them on the surface. So they began to hoe and plow. Gradually, they also started to weed the fields to guard them against parasites and to water and fertilize them. As more efforts were directed towards cereal cultivation, there was less time to gather and hunt wild species. The foragers became farmers. No single step separated the woman gathering wild wheat from the woman farming domesticated wheat, so it's hard to say exactly when the decisive transition to agriculture took place. But by 8500 BC, the Middle East was peppered with permanent villages such as Jericho, whose inhabitants spent most of their time cultivating a few domesticated species. With the move to permanent villages and the increase of food supply, the population began to grow. Giving up the nomadic lifestyle enabled women to have child every year. Babies were weaned at an earlier age. They could be fed on porridge and gruel. The extra hands were sorely needed in the fields, but the extra mouths quickly wiped out the food supply surpluses, so even more fields had to be planted. As people began living in disease-ridden settlements, children as children fed more on cereals and less on mother's milk, and as each child competed for his or her porridge with more and more siblings, child mortality soared. In most agricultural societies, at least one out of every children died before reaching 20, yet the increase in births still outpaced the increase in deaths. Humans kept having larger numbers of children. With time, the wheat wagon became more and more burdensome. Children died in droves, and the dogs are bred by the sweat of their brows. The average person in Jericho of 8500 BC lived a harder life than the average person of Jericho of 9500 BC and 13,000 BC. But nobody realized what was happening. Every generation continued to live like the previous generation, making only small improvements here and there in the way things were done. Paradoxically, a series of improvements, each of which was meant to make life easier, added up to a milestone around the necks of these farmers. Why did people make such fateful miscalculation? For the same reason that people throughout history has miscalculated. People were unable to fathom the full consequences of their decisions. Whenever they decided to do a bit of extra work, say, to hold the fields instead of scattering seeds on the surface, people thought, yes, we will have to work harder, but the harvest will be so bountiful, we won't have to worry anymore about lean years. Our children will never go to sleep hungry. It makes sense. If you work harder, you would make a better life. That was the plan. The first part of the plan went smoothly. People indeed worked harder, but people did not foresee that the number of children would increase, meaning that extra wheat would have to be shared between more children. Neither did the early farmer understand that Feeding children with more porridges and less breast milk would weaken their immune system, and that permanent settlements would be hotbeds for infectious diseases. They did not foresee that by increasing their dependence on a single source of food, they were actually exposing themselves even more to the depredations of drought. Nor did the farmers foresee that, in good years, their bulging granaries would attempt thieves and enemies, compelling them to start building walls and doing God's duty. Then why didn't humans abandon farming when the plan backfired? Partly because it took generations for small changes to accumulate and transform society, and by then, nobody remembered that they have ever lived differently. And partly because population growth burned humanity's bones. If the adoption of farming increased a village population from 100 to 110, which 10 people would have volunteered to starve so that the others could go back to the good old times? There was no going back. The trap snapped shut. The pursuit of an earlier life resulted in much hardship, and not for the last time. It happens to us today. How many young college graduates have taken demanding jobs in higher powered firms, vowing that they will work hard to earn money that will enable them to retire and pursue their real interests when they are 35? But by the time they reach that age, they have large mortgages, mortgages, children to school, houses in the suburbs that necessitate at least two cars per family, and a sense that life is not worth living with a really good wife and expensive holidays abroad. What are they supposed to do? Go back to digging up roots? No, they double the efforts and keep slaving away. One of history's few iron laws is that luxurious tend to become necessities and to spawn new obligations. Once people get used to a certain luxury, they take it for granted. Then they begin to count on it. Finally, they reach a point where they can live without it. Let's take another familiar example from our own time. Over the last few centuries, we have invented countless time-saving devices that are supposed to make life more relaxed. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, dishwashers, telephones, mobile phones, computers, and email. Previously, it took a lot of work to write a letter, address, and stamp an envelope and take it to the mailbox. It took days or weeks, maybe even months, to get a reply. Nowadays, I can dash up an email, send it halfway around the world a cloth, and if my addressee is online, receive a reply a minute later. I saved all that trouble, time, but do I live a more relaxed life? Sadly not. Back in the snail mail era, people usually only wrote letters when they had something important to relate. Rather than writing the first thing that came into their heads, they considered carefully what they wanted to say and how to phrase it. They expected to receive a similarly considered answer. Most people wrote and received no more than a handful of letters a month and seldom felt compelled to reply immediately. Today, I receive dozens of emails each day, all from people who expect a prompt reply. We thought we were saving time. Instead, we revved up the treadmill of life to 10 times its former speed and make our days more anxious and agitated. Here and there, a Luddite hotel refuses to open an email account, just as thousands of years ago some human beings refused to take up farming and so escaped the luxurious trap. But the agricultural revolution didn't need every band in a given region to join up. It only took one. Once one band settled down and started tilling, whether in the Middle East or Central America, agriculture was irresistible. Since farming created the conditions for swift demographic growth, farmers could usually overcome foragers by sheer weight of numbers. The foragers could either run away, abandoning their hunting grounds to fields and pasture, or take up the plowshare themselves. Either way, the old was doomed. The story of luxurious trap carries with it an important lesson. Humanity's search for an easier life released immense forces of change that transformed the world in ways nobody envisioned or wanted. Nobody plotted the agricultural revolution or sought human dependence on cereal cultivation. A series of trivial decisions aimed mostly at filling a few stomachs and gathering a little security had a cumulative effect of forcing Asian foragers to spend their days carrying water buckets under a scorching sun.